The night the Lawson boys walked out of the tree line, the air over Briar Ridge turned unnaturally still, as if the wind itself were holding its breath. Two figures appeared at the end of the old mining road, a pair of children moving in perfect step, their bare feet leaving no impressions in the dirt. Daniel Lawson lifted his head first, and when the passing truck's headlights washed over him, the driver slammed on the brakes so hard the tires screamed. Those faces were unmistakable. Every missing poster in town had seared them into memory. But the posters were 7 years old, and the boys standing in the beam of the headlights hadn't aged a single day. They didn't speak when the sheriff arrived, didn't flinch when the officers approached. Their skin was clean, their clothes unwrinkled, their hair neatly parted as if they had just stepped out of their mother's kitchen rather than the darkest part of the forest. They blinked only when spoken to, and even then it was slow, unnatural, as if each movement was carefully chosen rather than instinctive. At the station, under the harsh white bulb that hummed overhead, the boys sat across from the investigators with identical posture, hands resting on the table in the exact same angle. For a long time they said nothing. Then, together, so perfectly synchronized it prickled the skin of every man in the room, they opened their mouths. Their voices were soft, steady, drifting as though carried from far away. They began describing where they'd been, but nothing in their words connected to anything human. Their sentences twisted into impossible directions, referencing places that didn't exist on maps, and moments that didn't fit inside the flow of time. When Daniel paused, Micah continued the sentence without breaking rhythm, as if they shared one memory between two bodies. The light trembled above them, flickering in a pattern no one could explain, and each time it blinked, the boys' shadows shifted unnaturally, too fast, too sharp, almost out of sync with their stillness. One investigator stepped back, the hair on his arms rising as Micah's head slowly tilted, his eyes lifting toward the ceiling as if listening to something no one else could hear. And then, in a voice that didn't sound like a child at all, he whispered that they were never truly lost, only waiting for the ones who brought them back. When the Lawson boys, Daniel at 9 and Micah at 6, vanished in the summer of 1944, it happened with such quiet simplicity that the town of Briar Ridge didn't understand the gravity of it until it was too late. Their mother said she had only turned her back for a moment, long enough to fold a single bedsheet still warm from the clothesline. When she looked up, the yard gate was swinging open, creaking slightly in the breeze, and both boys were gone. At first she assumed they had run down to the creek like they often did, chasing frogs or skipping stones, but something about the stillness in the air unsettled her. The birds weren't singing, the wind had gone soft, and even the neighbor's hound, usually loud at all hours, stood rigid on its porch with its ears flattened. She walked to the gate, calling their names, expecting their small voices to answer from the trees, but what answered instead was a deep silence that grew heavier with every step she took. By the time their father returned from the fields, half the town was searching the woods with lanterns, their beams cutting into the darkening forest. What they found only deepened the unease. The boys' footprints trailed a short distance into the trees, but then they simply stopped, as if the children had taken one step forward and lifted off the ground. There were no signs of struggle, no scattered clothing, no broken branches that would suggest they ran or were chased. Just earth, soft and undisturbed, waiting beneath the paused footprints. Several volunteers ventured farther, calling out until their voices cracked, but the deeper they pushed, the more the woods seemed to absorb the sound, swallowing it in a way no forest should. When one man found a circle of flattened grass, perfectly smooth and unnaturally uniform, he hesitated before calling the sheriff. It looked too deliberate, too clean, and it gave him the troubling feeling that whatever had been there had hovered rather than Saturday. Rumors began almost immediately. Some whispered that a stranger had been seen near the ridge earlier that week. Others insisted it was a wild animal, though none could name one capable of leaving no prints behind. A few older residents spoke softly about lights they sometimes saw between the trees when the moon was low, but they only mentioned it to each other, never to the authorities. The sheriff tried to explain the disappearance in simple terms, telling the family that missing children wandered further than people thought and that the boys would surely be found by morning. But even he felt something was wrong, something he couldn't put into words. As night settled and lanterns flickered across the dark woods, every person searching felt the same quiet dread because nothing about the Lawson boys' disappearance felt human in the slightest. When the search party pushed deeper into the woods the following morning, the sunlight had barely begun to seep through the canopy, casting thin pale streaks across the forest floor. The men moved in a tight line, stepping carefully around roots and brambles, hoping to find some trace the lanterns might have missed the night before. But instead of finding answers, they stumbled upon markings that made them stop in their tracks. At first glance, the impressions in the soil looked like wagon ruts, long, slightly curved, and pressed deeper than any footprints they had followed. Yet no wagon could have made it through that dense part of the forest, and the spacing between the lines was too wide, too deliberate, as if whatever created them hadn't rolled across the earth but had settled onto it with unnatural precision. One of the searchers knelt beside the markings and ran his fingers along the grooves, expecting to feel the roughness of dragged wood or metal. Instead, the dirt felt smooth, tightly compacted, and faintly warm, as though whatever had touched the ground had done so recently. As they followed the curved lines around the trees, the grooves formed a near-perfect circle, wide enough for a cabin to sit inside it. The edges were clean, sharp, and symmetrical, lacking the messy overlap that human tools always left behind. A few of the older men exchanged glances, their faces pale in the early light. They knew every inch of these woods, every animal track and every mark left by hunters or loggers, and nothing about this circle matched anything they'd seen in all their years in Briar Ridge. Beyond the ring, the soil bore another unsettling detail, a long, narrow impression running directly from the center outward, fading into the underbrush. It looked like something heavy had been dragged, but the line was eerily smooth, almost polished, without the irregular scuffs a body or object would leave behind. One man murmured that the shape reminded him of the wake a canoe leaves when pushed through still water, except here the water was solid dirt. The comparison made the others uneasy. The idea of something gliding across the ground with such effortless motion didn't sit right with anyone. As they continued tracing the markings, they found patches of grass pressed flat in areas that didn't match the circle's symmetry, almost as if something had hovered above the ground, compressing the vegetation without touching it evenly. No broken twigs, no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing to suggest the Lawson boys had passed through or been dragged. The sheriff took notes with a shaking pencil, trying to describe patterns that defied the logic he had relied on his entire career. The men kept looking for mundane explanations, telling themselves it had to be a hunter's trap site or remnants of old logging equipment, but the silence of the woods disagreed. There was a weight to the air, a strange charged stillness that made even the birds avoid the trees above. By the time the searchers stepped back from the markings, a quiet fear settled over them, the kind that comes not from what is seen but from what cannot be explained. Whatever had been there had not moved like anything natural, and the strange circular indentation felt less like evidence of human activity and more like the footprint of something the forest itself had hesitated to swallow. As the days turned into weeks, the Lawson case slipped from a frantic town-wide hunt into a lingering, uneasy absence that Briar Ridge didn't know how to understand. The forest had been combed from one ridge to the next, every ravine, creek, and hollow searched so thoroughly that the men could navigate the woods blindfolded by the end of summer. Yet nothing new surfaced, not a scrap of clothing, not a footprint, not even a rumor solid enough to hold on to. With each passing day, the energy behind the search slowly thinned, and what replaced it was far worse than exhaustion. It was the strange acceptance that the woods had swallowed the boys whole, not as an accident or a crime, but as something intentional. Parents began calling their children inside earlier, not because of any confirmed danger, but because the quiet between the trees felt wrong. The usual forest sounds, crickets, owls, the rustle of small animals, seemed to fade after dusk as though the wildlife themselves refused to linger. Some nights, when the moon was full, people claimed the woods seemed to hold their breath, becoming so still that even the river sounded muffled. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Something had changed in Briar Ridge after the Lawson boys vanished, something invisible that tugged at the edges of normal life. As the official investigation slowed, whispers took over. A farmer swore he saw a faint bluish glow drifting through the pines one night, too steady to be a lantern and too bright to be fireflies. A group of teenagers passing near the old mining road said they heard a deep, humming vibration beneath their feet, like machinery underground, though there were no active mines for miles. An elderly woman who lived closest to the woods said she often woke to the sound of branches bending as if something large was moving through the treetops instead of on the forest floor. Her son dismissed it as wind, though he admitted privately that there hadn't been any wind those nights. Despite these unsettling stories, the sheriff's department eventually closed the case due to lack of evidence. They wrote it off as a tragedy, a disappearance with no culprit and no resolution, the kind that small towns were unfortunate enough to endure from time to time. But the sheriff himself didn't believe the neat summary printed on the final report. His deputies had seen the circle in the forest, had stood in the eerie stillness that surrounded it, and none of them had found a way to explain it to themselves, let alone to the community. And though no one would publicly connect the strange nightly sounds and unexplained lights to the missing Lawson boys, the timing made people uneasy. Briar Ridge tried to move forward, but underneath the quiet routines, a persistent tension tightened like a string pulled taut, waiting for anything, to break the silence that the forest seemed determined to keep. In the spring of 1951, 7 years after the Lawson boys slipped into the trees and vanished, Briar Ridge had settled into a strange quiet acceptance of the loss. Life had moved on in the way small towns always do, slowly, with an undercurrent of avoidance, as if speaking about the boys might somehow call back whatever had taken them. But just as the town had learned to live with the unanswered questions, everything changed on a fog-heavy evening when a maintenance worker driving along the closed mining road slammed on his brakes so suddenly the truck skidded sideways across the gravel. 2 small figures stood in the middle of the path, side by side, their silhouettes softened by the fog but unmistakably those of children. At first he thought they were trespassers from a nearby farm, but as he stepped out of the truck and the headlights brightened their faces, a cold shock rolled through him. He knew those faces. Everyone in town knew them. Yet something was deeply wrong about the way they stood there calm, still, almost posed. Daniel and Micah Lawson had not aged. Their cheeks were still round with childhood softness, their hair was the same length and cut as in the missing posters, and their clothes, simple cotton shirts and shorts, were clean, crisp, and utterly untouched by time. The worker felt his chest tighten as he tried to speak to them, asking where they had been, who they were with, whether they were hurt. They didn't answer. Their eyes followed him, but their expressions held no fear, no confusion, not even relief at being found. They looked as if they had simply stepped out of 1944 and into 1951 without noticing the intervening years. When the sheriff arrived, the boys still hadn't moved. They walked obediently to the patrol car when directed, their footsteps strangely soft on the gravel, almost too light for their bodies. Their silence was unsettling, not the panicked muteness of traumatized children but something colder, measured, as if they were listening intently to something no one else could hear. The sheriff kept glancing at the rearview mirror as he drove them to the station, watching the boys sit perfectly still, their hands folded neatly in their laps, their gazes fixed forward as though the world outside the windows didn't concern them. The first officer to greet them inside the station felt the hair rise on his arms the moment they stepped into the fluorescent light. Something about the way their shadows fell across the floor seemed off, but he couldn't explain how. He only knew that the Lawson boys who had returned were not the same children who had vanished into the trees, and whatever had happened to them in those missing years lingered in the air around them like a cold, invisible draft. The silence between the 2 boys felt too synchronized, too intentional, as if they were waiting for the moment someone finally asked the question they already knew how to answer. When the boys were brought into the sheriff's office, the shock that rippled through the building was immediate and palpable. Officers who had worked the original case recognized the children instantly, and for a long moment no one could bring themselves to speak. The boys' faces were exactly the same as the photographs pinned to the old case file: round cheeks, unscarred skin, wide eyes untouched by 7 missing years. Daniel still had the small chipped front tooth noted in the original report, and Micah still had the faint birthmark behind his left ear. These were details that time should have altered, even if only subtly, yet the boys appeared frozen in the exact age and form they'd been when they vanished. Some of the younger deputies, who had been too young to remember the initial search, whispered among themselves, asking how 2 children could have survived in the wilderness so long without aging, but the older men only exchanged tight, uneasy looks. They had been in those woods. They knew these children hadn't simply been hiding. What unsettled everyone even more was the boys' condition. Their clothes were spotless, their hair neatly combed, and their skin showed no signs of exposure, no sunburn, no insect bites, no grime beneath their fingernails. The sheriff examined their hands closely, noticing how clean they were, as if they had been washed moments before being found. It was impossible. Children who'd been living outside, or even trapped somewhere underground, would have shown some wear. But Daniel and Micah looked untouched by the world, almost untouched by life itself. When the sheriff asked where they had been, both boys turned their heads toward him at the exact same moment, their movements smooth and unhurried, not childlike in the slightest. The doctor who arrived shortly afterward approached them with cautious professionalism, but even he faltered at the sight. He checked their heart rates and pupils, examined their reactions to light, and felt the warmth of their skin. Everything was normal, perfectly normal, yet the perfection was what troubled him. Children who had undergone severe trauma usually flinched at sudden movements, cried unexpectedly, or clung to familiar adults. But the Lawson boys sat still, quiet, their breathing steady, their eyes tracking the doctor with an eerie calm. They didn't ask for their parents. They didn't show relief at being rescued. They didn't behave like children who had been lost. Instead, they acted like children who had been prepared for this exact moment. The sheriff found himself instinctively lowering his voice when speaking near them, as though afraid they might hear something they shouldn't. Every adult in the room felt it, the sense that the boys were studying them just as intently as they were studying the boys. Nothing about their presence felt accidental. It felt orchestrated, as though their reappearance had been timed, their condition curated, and their silence chosen. And beneath the confusion and fear, one realization settled heavily among the officers. Whatever had happened to Daniel and Micah during those 7 lost years, it had shaped them into something entirely unfamiliar, and the station's thin walls suddenly felt far too small to contain them. When the interrogation finally began, the officers expected hesitation, confusion, or even panic, anything that resembled the behavior of children who had been missing for 7 long years. Instead, the room fell into an unnatural quiet the moment Daniel and Micah were seated at the table. They folded their hands neatly, mirroring each other's posture so precisely that one of the deputies shifted uncomfortably, whispering that no brothers sat like that unless they had rehearsed it. The sheriff cleared his throat and began with simple questions: names, ages, where they had been, who they were with. For a long stretch of seconds, the boys didn't respond. Their faces were calm, almost serene, and their eyes didn't dart around the room like frightened children. They stared directly at the sheriff, unblinking, as though waiting for something unspoken. Then Daniel opened his mouth, and Micah followed half a heartbeat later, their voices overlapping in a way that made the hairs rise on every man's neck. It wasn't chaotic children's chatter. It was synchronized speech, smooth and steady, each boy finishing the other's words with a precision that felt impossibly practiced. Their tone was all wrong too, flat, measured, void of the typical tremble or emotion expected from kids recounting a traumatic ordeal. They spoke like adults reading from a script they had memorized long before stepping into the room. At first, their sentences were simple, almost mundane. We walked, Daniel began, and Micah continued, for a long time. But then the words twisted into strange, impossible phrases. They mentioned a journey that had no steps, a place where the ground waited above, and a corridor that moved when you breathed. The sheriff exchanged uneasy glances with the doctor and his deputies, all of them trying to rationalize the bizarre descriptions as the disordered memories of abused or manipulated children. Yet the boys didn't speak like victims. They spoke with clarity, confidence, and an eerie consistency, as though the two of them were sharing one mind and simply dividing the task of expressing it. As the interview progressed, the sheriff noticed something even more unsettling. Daniel and Micah never interrupted each other, never hesitated, never looked away from whoever was speaking to them. Their responses were immediate, too immediate, as if they weren't thinking before answering but recalling information that had already been assigned to them. And each time a deputy raised his voice or shifted suddenly in his chair, both boys turned their heads at the exact same angle and speed, perfectly aligned, like reflections of each other rather than siblings. The doctor, observing quietly from the corner, scribbled a note in his file that made the sheriff tilt his head to read it. Underlined twice were 4 words that chilled him more than the boys' strange speech: voices do not match children. It wasn't just the content of what they said, it was the way they said it. The cadence. The calmness. The disquieting maturity. The sound was coming from their mouths, but nothing about it felt naturally human, and the room grew colder with each passing sentence. When the boys began describing where they had been, the room shifted in a way that no one could quite name. At first, Daniel spoke alone, his voice calm, soft, too steady for a child recounting 7 years of disappearance. But as his words formed images no one in the room recognized, Micah naturally slipped into the explanation without missing a beat, continuing the description with the same tone and rhythm, as if the story belonged to both of them in a perfectly shared memory. They spoke about a place they called beneath the trees but above the sky, a phrase that immediately unsettled the sheriff because it didn't follow any geography he knew. It wasn't poetic, and it wasn't childish, it felt precise, like a location they had memorized rather than imagined. When asked to clarify, Daniel's eyes drifted upward as though he were looking through the ceiling, and he said the ground wasn't always under them, that sometimes it shifted to the side or behind them. Micah added that the air felt thick and light at the same time, like breathing through cloth made of light. The deputies exchanged confused glances, unsure if the boys were describing a cave, a bunker, or a dream. Yet the boys' tone didn't resemble the chaotic ramblings of traumatized children. They spoke with a strange conviction, each phrase clipped and clean, each detail matching perfectly between them. They described corridors that weren't built but grown, as though the walls were alive and could sense when someone walked near them. Daniel said the surfaces pulsed faintly, like a slow heartbeat under stone, and Micah confirmed it with a nod, adding that the walls listened when you touched them. Their descriptions were too synchronized, too aligned, the same impossible geometry flowing from both mouths as if the memory didn't belong to two boys but a single entity speaking through them in two bodies. One officer tried to redirect them, asking if they had been kept in some underground bunker or hidden facility, but Micah shook his head with eerie confidence. He said there were no doors, only openings that appeared when the space decided they should move. Daniel said the place wasn't dark, not entirely, because light seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sheriff scribbled notes while the doctor quietly observed, his expression tightening each time the boys used phrases that didn't fit any human environment. None of their words referred to people, machines, animals, or structures. Instead, they spoke of shapes, movements, and sensations that defied everything the men in the room understood about the natural world. The longer the boys spoke, the more apparent it became that they weren't describing a location that existed in any recognizable sense. Their language hinted at scale and direction that made no physical sense, and their calm certainty only intensified the discomfort. It wasn't that the investigators couldn't comprehend the details. It was that the boys described their strange surroundings with a level of familiarity and acceptance that suggested they hadn't been terrified or lost at all, but instead had learned to move through that place as if guided by something that had been expecting them from the moment they disappeared in 1944. As the interview stretched on, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier, almost suffocating. The sheriff and his deputies had expected confusion, hesitation, or even fear from the Lawson boys, but instead, there was a calm that felt unnatural, almost deliberate. Daniel continued to speak in his measured, almost rehearsed cadence, and Micah followed in perfect alignment, finishing sentences as though the two shared a single consciousness. Then, without warning, Micah's small frame stiffened. His head lifted slowly, eyes fixed on the ceiling, and he stopped speaking entirely. A strange silence filled the room, more profound than the absence of sound. Every officer instinctively leaned forward, sensing that something was unfolding beyond their understanding. Micah's gaze remained locked above, and his lips moved faintly, forming words that were barely audible. He repeated a single phrase over and over, monotone yet charged with an intensity that sent shivers down the spines of all present. They will come back for what they left behind. The words were not spoken as a warning or a threat, nor did they seem to be addressed to anyone in the room. They were a statement of fact, delivered with a certainty that no child could possess, and yet, coming from a 6-year-old, it carried a weight that silenced the room entirely. The sheriff felt a chill crawl up his neck as he realized that the statement implied knowledge, a memory, or perhaps even participation in something the investigators could not comprehend. Daniel glanced at his brother, but he showed no surprise or reaction. Instead, he continued speaking calmly, describing the strange place beneath the trees but above the sky, as if Micah's cryptic repetition were a normal part of the conversation. This contrast between the two boys heightened the unease. One was delivering incomprehensible insight, while the other maintained an unsettling normalcy. The deputies whispered among themselves, exchanging nervous glances, none of them able to explain why the repetition made their stomachs churn. Even the doctor, who had seen unexplainable phenomena in his career, leaned back with a hand over his mouth, whispering a wordless acknowledgement of the horror in front of them. Time seemed to stretch as Micah continued, his small voice a relentless, hypnotic rhythm. The words were meaningless in any ordinary sense, but their insistence suggested a ritualistic or preordained significance. The sheriff's pen hovered over his notebook, unable to capture the full scope of what was happening, because what they were witnessing was beyond human comprehension. The room itself seemed to respond, the air grew heavier, colder, and the light flickered faintly as if acknowledging the presence of something unseen. Even without understanding the full meaning of Micah's words, every adult present felt the same visceral reaction, a bone-deep certainty that whatever they were, it was coming back, and that the Lawson boys had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone could imagine. As the questioning continued, one of the younger deputies noticed something that made him freeze mid-note. The boys' shadows, cast sharply on the walls by the harsh fluorescent lights, did not behave normally. At first, he thought it was a trick of the flickering bulb above, or perhaps the angle of the table, but as he observed more closely, the pattern became undeniable. Daniel and Micah's outlines shifted slightly, imperceptibly, as if their bodies were one step ahead of the shadows themselves. When Daniel leaned forward, the shadow lagged by a fraction of a second, and when Micah tilted his head, the shadow seemed to distort unnaturally, elongating in a direction that defied the single light source. Every officer in the room, even the sheriff, noticed it, though no one wanted to speak at first, unsure if admitting it would make them sound insane. The phenomenon became even more unsettling when the boys' movements slowed or stopped. Their shadows continued to shift subtly, a faint ripple across the floor and walls, as if responding to some unseen force. The effect was so precise and deliberate that it felt intentional, almost conscious. The deputies whispered among themselves, describing it as if the boys were out of sync with reality, though none could articulate why it unsettled them so profoundly. Each flicker of the shadow seemed to hint at something larger, something lurking just beyond comprehension, and the weight of it pressed down on the room with a palpable intensity. The sheriff tried to focus on the conversation, asking questions about their time away, but the shadows distracted him, tugging at the edges of reason. He realized that nothing the boys said could be entirely trusted, not because they lied, but because their presence, combined with the shifting outlines, suggested that they were only partially anchored in the world everyone else occupied. The doctor, still quietly observing, leaned forward and murmured that he had never seen anything like it, that no natural explanation could account for shadows behaving independently of their source. Even the seasoned investigators, familiar with strange occurrences in the forest, felt their confidence crumble. Something about the boys had altered the very physics of the room, bending light and perception in a subtle, terrifying way. As the minutes stretched, the officers found themselves instinctively stepping back, their attention caught between the boys' calm demeanor and the disjointed, almost alien dance of the shadows. Every small movement, even the slightest turn of a head, created new distortions. And in those distortions, every man sensed a presence beyond the boys themselves, a silent, watching force tethered to them. The realization settled into the pit of their stomachs with a slow, chilling certainty. Daniel and Micah were not simply children returned. They carried something with them, something unhuman, that the shadows could not contain, something that might be waiting, just beyond sight, for the next moment to reveal itself. Just as investigators were beginning to process the boys' strange behavior and the unnatural phenomena surrounding them, a tension filled the room that no one could name. The interview had reached a quiet lull, the kind that comes when words have been exhausted but the air itself is heavy with expectation. Daniel and Micah sat perfectly still, their hands folded neatly on the table, their eyes tracking each officer's movements with unnerving precision. Then, without warning, the boys moved as one. It was subtle at first, a shift in posture, a soft creak of the chair, but in that single motion, something primal stirred in the adults present. The air seemed to pulse, vibrating faintly as though responding to their movement, and the light overhead flickered once, twice, then stabilized. The officers instinctively leaned forward, hearts pounding, because they realized the boys were about to do something no one could anticipate. Before anyone could react, both boys stood, walked to the door, and without hesitation, simply disappeared. The sudden absence left an empty stillness, as if they had been erased rather than left. There was no sound of a struggle, no rustle of clothing, no footsteps echoing in the hallway, only the lingering, oppressive awareness of their presence, now gone. The sheriff's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, half expecting to find them just outside. But there was nothing. The room felt impossibly still, the silence now heavier than any words that had been spoken. The investigators exchanged frantic glances, calling the boys' names, but the voices echoed back without answer. It was as if the air itself had swallowed them whole. When the officers examined the area where the boys had been standing, they discovered something impossible: 2 footprints burned into the concrete floor. They were perfectly formed, small and unblemished, almost glowing faintly in the fluorescent light. The edges were sharp and clean, with no trace of smudging or debris. The doctor crouched beside them, running his finger along the impression, but the surface was cold and solid, as if the floor had somehow absorbed the boy's presence and then expelled it instantaneously. None of the officers could explain how children could leave such marks without disturbing the surrounding dust, how they could vanish from a room without opening a door, without creating any disturbance, without a sound. The room, once filled with tense anticipation, now felt hollow, the echo of their absence pressing on every shoulder. The unnatural footprints, combined with their sudden disappearance, left the investigators reeling. Notes were scribbled frantically, cameras snapped, but none of it seemed capable of capturing the truth. Each officer felt a creeping dread, a visceral understanding that the boys' return had never been ordinary, that whatever had brought them back and then taken them again was far beyond human comprehension. And as they stood in the room, staring at the scorched impressions, a quiet, inescapable realization settled over them. The Lawson boys had left something behind, but it was not something any of them could fully understand, see, or explain, and the forest that had once swallowed them seemed to have followed them into the walls of the station itself.